Good evening, everybody. Hello, I'm Jen Uphoff Gray. I'm Artistic Director of Forward Theater Company, and welcome to this live talkback with our esteemed guest, Lewiston Clarkston playwright, Samuel D. Hunter. We are so grateful to Sam for joining us tonight. For those of you who may be new to Forward Theater Company, this pair of companion plays, Lewiston and Clarkston, directed by myself and my co-host here, Jake Penner, are currently streaming at overturecenter.org from now until April 25th. Before we introduce our guest, I just want to give you a brief context for this evening. As with all of Forward Theater's talkbacks, they're meant to be interactive. So if you have a question for Sam or about any aspect of the productions, please go ahead and type those into the chat as you're watching. And our communications director, Scott Hayden, will be able to pass those questions on along to us as we go a little later in this hour. And I will say, if you haven't yet seen Lewiston Clarkston, just keep in mind that we are likely to mention a spoiler or two tonight. So you may want to stop and save watching this interview for later if that's the case. But I can't wait to get going with this conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Jake to introduce Sam.
Good evening, everybody. I have the honor of introducing our playwright, Samuel D. Hunter, tonight. Samuel D. Hunter's plays include The Whale, A Bright New Boise, The Few, A Great Wilderness, Rest, Pocatello, Lewiston Clarkston, The Healing, The Harvest, and Greater Clements. He is the recipient of a 2014 MacArthur Genius Grant Fellowship, a 2012 Whiting Writers Award, the 2013 Otis Guernsey New Voices Award, the 2011 Sky Cooper Prize, the 2008 Pony Lark Fellowship, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Idaho. A published anthology of his work is available from TCG Books. He is a member of New Dramatists, an ensemble playwright at Victory Gardens, a member of Partial Comfort Productions, and was a 2013 resident playwright at Arena Stage. Sam has adapted his play The Whale for a film being directed by Darren Aronofsky. A native of northern Idaho, Sam lives in New York City. He holds degrees in playwriting from NYU, the Iowa Playwrights Workshop, and Juilliard. Samuel D. Hunter, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, I want to jump right in with a little bit of personal history because many of us, as we all know, those of us who work in the profession can have a change of focus at a certain point in our journeys, typically in our early careers. And I'm wondering if you knew that you wanted to be a playwright from the get-go, or if you started doing something else within the theater and eventually transitioned to writing plays, whether out of necessity or a change in focus or what have you.
Yeah, I had kind of I did make the decision pretty early. I mean, I wrote my first play when I was like 16, 17. But it did kind of feel like I had a circuitous journey in high school toward that. I mean, for most of my childhood, I was really interested in music and I wanted to be a musician, and I still love music and I still play when I can. But around like 10th, 11th grade, I just started getting much more interested in writing, and I was going to a pretty conservative religious high school at the time. And so writing became kind of an outlet for me as like a closeted teen. And so I was writing like bad poetry and like angsty teenage stuff. But then I started realizing that what I really loved about poetry was reading it out loud. And I loved like all these old recordings of like Allen Ginsberg reading Kaddish or whatever. And so I loved reading my own stuff out loud. And I think that naturally kind of segued into writing plays. And I was also like actively interested in the theater. I mean, I did community theater growing up, and, we weren't doing modern plays. The most modern play I did when I was a teenager was Arsenic and Old Lace. But it just started an interest for me. And then I saw production of Part 1 of Angels in America at the University of Idaho when I was like either 16 or 17, right when I first started writing plays. And it was, it just kind of blasted me wide open. And then I was just going to go to the University of Idaho to study theater, probably just like general theater studies. And because that's, that's where my brother went, was where my parents went. It was in my hometown in Moscow. Like I just never thought I would go anywhere other than the University of Idaho. But then somebody in community theater mentioned to me that she thought that Tony Kushner taught playwriting at NYU, which he didn't. But I applied and, kind of miraculously got in, and I moved to New York right after I turned 18. And I've just been kind of on that track ever since.
Tell us a little bit about the origin story of Lewiston and Clarkston and that development process. Like, how have these plays evolved since those early drafts?
Yeah, and stop me if I'm babbling, because this is actually, like, of all of my projects, this was like the longest, developmental and gestation period. But it all began when I was with my husband, and we were in Idaho, and we were driving through the Lewis Clark Valley for some reason, and my husband kind of half jokingly said, "You should write a play called Lewiston and a play called Clarkston." Which wasn't that crazy of a joke, because I had written a play called Pocatello, I had written a play called A Bright New Boise, but as soon as he said it, I was just like, that. I mean, just it immediately kind of unfolded as like, oh, that's actually really a really interesting idea. And I had already been, engaged with, writing plays that were all kind of connected to one another, and plays that, dovetail off one. I mean, I think all of my plays kind of feel very much the same chapter, the chapters in the same book. And I thought, oh, well, this is an opportunity to do it, like, really deliberately, and write two plays that are linked, not in terms of plot or character, though I did toy with that idea a little bit early on. But plays that were more sort of connected on a spiritual level, if I can say that without sounding really pretentious. But so I had the idea for Clarkston first, and I wrote that play. Actually, while I was in residence at the O'Neill Theater Center in Waterford, Connecticut, which is why one of the characters is from Waterford, Connecticut. And then workshopped that a bunch. And then while I was workshopping that, I wrote Lewiston. And I always knew that Lewiston wanted to go first. And once I had, written Clarkston and thought about what Lewiston wanted to be, I kind of realized that Clarkston is fundamentally a play about the future, and Lewiston is fundamentally a play about the past. And writing a play about the past is just a lot harder. It's, like, writing a play about the future, it's like, it bounces along. There's forward movement. There's, like, a new relationship, and, like, everybody, they're kind of looking forward and sailing forward into this uncertain future. But with Lewiston, it's fundamentally a play about two characters who need to unpack a lot of history that neither of them want to unpack in the way that they should be unpacking it, so that play was a lot harder to write. And I did a lot more drafts of that play. And just because there's so much more, like, complicated backstory and history. And I remember the premiere of that play in Long Wharf. I was furiously rewriting up until I think I was putting in stuff during previews. I mean, I was being very difficult with those poor actors who did such a beautiful job. But so yeah, and then we actually, if I'm right, I think we premiered Clarkston first in Dallas, and then I premiered Lewiston at Long Wharf in New Haven. Clarkston was directed by Davis McCallum, who was a frequent collaborator of mine, and then Lewiston was directed by Eric Ting, who's a wonderful director. He also directed a play of mine called The Great Wilderness at Williamstown Theater Festival a few years back. And then I kind of felt like, okay, I've given both these plays their due diligence in this first production. Now, how do we put them together? Which was, like, the project that I wanted to do from the very beginning. And, my first impulse, I remember I had a meeting with Bill Rausch, who then was running the Ashland, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, because I thought, well, that's a perfect place to premiere them, and like Oregon and the sort of the West, and initially I had this idea of, like, what if we did it in a theater, with these kind of giant Western frescoes in the background of these, like, idealized Western, kind of falsely idealized, Western notions, and then you just kind of, like, telescope into these tiny characters within that huge landscape. But as I was kind of talking to Bill about it, Daniela Topol, who runs the Rattlestick Playwrights Theater in New York, where I had a play called The Few back in 2013 or 14, came to me, and she was really interested in the idea of doing them both at Rattlestick. And I love Rattlestick, but I was like, might be the opposite of what it needs, because it's like this very small theater in the West Village of Manhattan. It's like the most New York kind of feeling theater. So I mean, like, how are we going to make a Costco in there? How are we going to, just all these questions. But she had this really brave idea of basically gutting the entire theater, which is something that hadn't happened in 20 years, 25 years. And it was really smart strategically on her part too, because the theater really needed a gut renovation. It just really needed work. It needed a lot of, love and care. And so she just uses it as an opportunity to just kind of like demolish the place. And as we were doing it, what started to become apparent was like, Rattlesnake, I believe, is the second oldest theater in New York City. And so, when we were like sawing into the stage to move the stage, to essentially take away the stage, I was looking at it and I was like, oh, this wood is from like the, mid 19th century, and so there was this kind of, and when we took off it's an old church actually, which also felt really appropriate. So when we took away the masking, there were like glass, stained glass windows, and it felt really like, it did have design. Dane Laffrey did the design. It was very well designed, but we didn't try to make it look like anything other than it was, which was this old church in the West Village. And I think that Davis, who directed that production, did such a beautiful, clear-eyed job of just sort of presenting the plays in the most stripped down way possible. To only, I think we only did it for, 50 people every night. And then we fed people dinner in between the two plays. And so it was like nearly 4 hours long. And yeah, it was just it was really, the actors were so good and the experience was so lovely. So yeah, that's the really long version.
No, that's awesome. And I'm just, to follow up on that, I'm curious. So with Clarkston coming first and then writing Lewiston, but always sort of intending them to speak to each other, did you then find yourself going back and revising Clarkston with what you learned from Lewiston? Because I certainly know Jake and I talked all the time about all these little, whether they were thematic or props or whatever, there seemed to be all these wonderful little Easter eggs between them that connected them together.
I think it was more, I think I did change some stuff in Clarkston, but it was more like which maybe was also what was difficult about making Lewiston, was because I did want it to echo deliberately with Clarkston. And so like, I realized at some point that I wanted a tent to be built in both plays. And I wanted these, half smoked cigarettes, or what I mean? Just like little things like that to just sort of like echo between the two plays. There's more now, but now I'm kind of forgetting what they are. But the 4th of July thing, and so I think it was more a process of sort of delicately fashioning Lewiston to echo with Clarkston, if I remember right.
Great.
So I want to ask about something that I've noticed a little bit in your work across a couple of different plays. You mentioned A Bright New Boise. And so like A Bright New Boise, Clarkston is set in and around a corporate retail environment and features characters searching for a very human connection in what can seem like a very sterile environment. So what is it about places like Costco and Hobby Lobby that sparked this?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is like the first job I had as a kid was at a Walmart. And so like, when I was 16, 17, I was working at this Walmart, and that was also the time that I was starting to realize that I wanted to be a playwright. And so I would like secretly take a notebook, that I wasn't allowed to have. And I would like write in the notebook whenever I could. So I think that's probably like the genesis of it. But the more that I've kind of embraced the idea, probably starting with, though probably not even starting with A Bright New Boise, because I think even before that, even like the student plays I was writing before that, there was a lot of like kind of desolate suburbia kind of stuff going on. And I think because I've always wanted to write these plays with really big themes about like people searching for God, searching for faith, searching for human connection, these really huge emotional, spiritual ideas. And it's that thing of like, can you articulate those ideas more clearly in an environment that seems like the total opposite, the total opposite of the place where you would usually discuss those things. Like it's one thing to like write a play about a religious person and then set that play in a convent. It's another thing to write a play about a religious person and set that in a Hobby Lobby. And maybe you can actually articulate the religious crisis of it more easily in the Hobby Lobby because of that contrast, you know. And I think Clarkston is kind of the same thing, you know, where there's this sterile environment of the Costco, but these guys are, you know, one of them's dealing with his own, and this is spoiling, but, you know, one of them is dealing with his impending death. And the other one is dealing with, you know, really there is not him, the other one, but you know, you know, Chris is dealing with, you know, what does the rest of my life look like? You know, like he's in this deeply codependent relationship with his mother and can't seem to get out of it. And again, it just seemed like those stories could be more clearly told in a parking lot rather than like in the grandeur of the Western wilderness itself, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to jump ahead to a question I was going to ask a little later, but it's building on something you just said. You know, having read so many of your plays over the last decade, there's some really clear threads, as you say, that are woven throughout your body of work. And I love how they're in conversation with each other and, you know, exploring ideas of community, religion, family, mortality. And I'm wondering, are there particular threads that you're wanting to explore next, especially knowing that you know, you've had a lot of life changes yourself. I mean, becoming a parent, getting into movie making, the pandemic that we've all been, you know, living through. And I'm wondering if you're looking at some of those same threads with these new eyes, or if there are new threads that are really appealing to you right now.
It does feel like, I mean, I have no idea because I'm so kind of in the middle of it, so I don't know what's going to happen. But it kind of felt like the last play that I had in New York that closed right before the pandemic, it was this big 7-character, 3-hour tragedy.
And so good.
You know, but it was a hard play to write. It was a hard play to watch. It was a hard play to produce. You know, it was really dark. And I think, you know, I wrote it on the heels of the 2016 election. It's not an overtly political play, but to me, it was really deeply connected to a sense of dread and destruction. And for the first time, I think, you know, so many of my plays are about people who are desperately trying to save one another, and then in some way they connect just barely at the end of the play. It's like their hands just barely reaching each other. But Greta Clemens was kind of the experiment of what if they miss each other just barely, and the sort of like tragedy of that. I mean, look, there's Lewiston right there. There's a moment they connect at the very, very end. You know what I mean? Like just barely being able to sort of like grasp onto one another and save each other. But Greta Clemens didn't afford that to the characters, you know, because I think I was living in the moment of like, maybe I need to look at the darkness. Maybe I actually need to go straight at the sort of like dark maw of, you know, what felt like was just sort of encapsulating us all. And having like produced that, I think I kind of came out of it, you know, it was also like I realized when I was doing it that it was the 10th play that I had produced in New York. And it was like the longest play and the darkest play. And I kind of felt like I went, like I burst through something with that play. And then on the other side of it, I was like, oh, like what is on the other side of this? And I wrote a play, which was supposed to be in production right now at the Signature, called A Case for the Existence of God, which is a very, very, it's set in a cubicle and it's 2 characters and they don't even stand up until the final moments of the play. And there are no set changes. I mean, it's the most stripped, it's a kind of theater you can do in this extended stay America kitchen, you know? And with that, I kind of like was, you know, past the sort of like carnage of Greta Clemens. I was looking towards something maybe a little more hopeful, probably because I just became a parent and you know, my kid is likely going to live to see the year 2100. And so maybe I don't have the luxury anymore of sort of like, of sinking into the darkness of it all, you know. And it's not an easy play. I mean, it's not, but it's a play that I think is reaching toward hope again. And that's, I guess it's kind of just, this all sounds so pretentious. It sounds like I'm just talking about myself over and over, but like, but it just kind of feels like I myself am kind of reaching toward a new sort of like faith. I don't want to say optimism, but just like faith. And so that's where I am right now. And I'm not actually sure what that's going to look like going forward.
Well, parenthood will do that to you.
Yeah, yeah, it really will.
Teenagers, so believe me, it'll definitely. You need that. You need that. It's wonderful. Jake, you're up.
Sure. So I'm curious now that we're talking about an evolution of consciousness, I suppose. When we chose these plays, this was going back about 2 years ago now, Jen. I remember when we read them at our advisory company table where we debate which plays to do in the future. It was kind of a unanimous, we have to do these plays. How do we do these plays now? Because we've only ever done one at a time. I thought that I knew what the play Clarkston was about 2 years ago. And then over the course of this year, as I had to revisit it, getting ready to do the production, and Jen, I'm sure you had the same experience, all of a sudden this thing was resonating for me in a completely different way. So, and even now that I've gotten a week and a half away from production now, I'm already starting to see it with new eyes. And I'm wondering, you've had a couple of years since the premiere production, you've probably seen a few productions, but maybe ours included. Have your ideas about the plays changed as a result of what's happened nationally or globally in the last year or so?
Can I actually ask you the same question first? Because you said that you're thinking of it has kind of changed. How has it changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I sort of went back and looked at an interview that we had done almost a year ago now about the plays. And I was really hooked into the idea of legacy. And I think I still am with the plays. I think that is central to what's going on. But if I had to boil down Clarkston at least to one word that I kept returning to over and over and over again, and we talked a lot about this in the rehearsal room, it would be pioneers. I see all three of these characters in their own way as being pioneers in their own lives. I mean, all three of them are sort of stepping out into a completely unknown wilderness that is very personal to them. You made reference to one of the characters having to deal with the idea of death probably 50 years before he should be. So he's literally standing at the foot of the undiscovered country. And then you've got these other two characters that you mentioned were in this codependent relationship and probably shouldn't be. But what does life look like without each other? What does identity look like without each other? What is a future where they're not having to balance this relationship look like? And it seems to scare the hell out of both of them. And yet on some level, I think they're going ahead with it because they know they have to. So that to me was central to my approach to Clarkston. And it felt analogous to what we're all now doing. We're all looking ahead to a world that is going to be different in some way. And we're not 100% sure how, but we're now starting to take those baby steps back out into it. And so that to me felt like the right orientation of the story to explore right now.
I think that's exactly right, Jake. And I actually feel very similarly that when I originally had this idea to write the play, what was so initially really interesting for me was this idea of like Lewis and Clark 200 years later, and like what is that? You know what I mean? And like that really kind of complicated, arguably really shitty legacy of these two guys walking across the country. Like what does that mean for us now? And like, if we are the sort of like children of that, where does that mean? What does that mean for us? You know what I mean? Like if we are wrapped up in that really complicated legacy, like what does that mean for us when we have to go to work every day and try to pay off our student loans, or like have to sell off our land to these crappy condos that are named after my ancestor, who I have very complicated feelings about, So that's for me what was so interesting. But I think that like, like most plays, I think I have to write them and work on them a lot and then see them produce, and then I do understand a little bit more how they operate. And I think you're right. It is like, because it took me a really long time to realize that Clarkston was about the future and Lewiston was about the past. And even though I think that's true, I think both of the plays are about how do we step forward out of this. You know what I mean? Like legacy aside, like the history aside, just as human beings, not that you can ever put history aside, but in this moment, here we are working at this Costco. You have 7 years to live. Like, is there a path forward? Like, how do we take those steps forward? I think there's that line in Lewiston where Marnie says, we have to believe that something good is possible, right? ? And Alice doesn't really respond. And I think that kind of idea became, as I worked with the plays more and more, that idea became like, oh, that's kind of the kernel to the whole thing. Is like, I guess we're moving forward. We have no idea what that future is. You know what I mean? But like, we can't continue doing the thing that we've been doing because we're just like wasting time, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Here's a question from our own Mike Fisher. Do you feel similar hopefulness about the future of theater, given all we've been through in the past year? Ooh, start off with an easy one, Mike.
No, it's a really fair question. I mean, look, there are much smarter people than me who are in the business of making theater and maintaining theater who would be much more equipped to answer that question the full way. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm just a guy who's typing. So I don't know. I fear for the theater. You know, like I really fear for these. You know, especially like the more mid-sized companies that like maybe have buildings and a mortgage and you know their donors don't have as deep a pockets as the really big guys. You know, and you know, I worry a lot. I remember back when I was coming up as a playwright, right when I was coming out of school, and you know, when the housing crisis hit, I remember a lot of theaters just shuttering.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it was really dark. I remember I was doing a lot of work at the Lark at the time, and John Iser, the artistic director, just had like a piece of paper above his desk that just was a running tally of the theaters that had shuttered. And I fear there's going to be that, but and there will be that. I mean, look, it's going to be really, really hard. Economically, it's going to be really, really hard. But you know, I also think that people are probably going to be really desperate to go be in a space and see a live performance. You know, like I think this thing has been taken away from us for a full year, and that has made, and for me personally, it's really like, you know, reminded me why I love it and why I keep doing it. You know what I mean? Because I think like a lot of it, like being a theater person is hard. Like you have to work really hard. It's like being on a treadmill, but you know, you're just like running really, really hard. And then that treadmill just stopped. And I think we all just kind of looked at each other and we're like, oh, whoa, the treadmill's stopped. And so I do think that like coming out of this, there's like maybe we'll be all the more thoughtful about what we choose, you know, to put on stage, you know. And it's not just going to be like, you know, what's the play that'll work, or what's the musical that'll fill the seats or whatever, you know, that it's like, no, let's get past this and actually talk about like what theater should be and what theater needs to be. Because even before this, like the theater was in a crisis of like, you know, getting younger people to come to these subscription houses, and like, you know, how do we do the Christmas Carol tentpole but still do the new work? You know what I mean? There's already all of these conversations going on that I think are just, we're going to have to really reckon with it in a real way now, which is good, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
You know?
Dovetailing off of that, are there playwrights working now in the theater that particularly excite you? Are there things that you get really jazzed to go see when you know that fill in the blank has a new script out?
I mean, I feel like there was this like cohort that I had coming up in New York, like I think back to like the Ars Nova writers group that I was in like 2008, 2009, and it's astonishing to me how those are the playwrights. So many of those playwrights are still the ones that I love so much. I mean, it was like Annie Baker and Amy Herzog and Brandon Jacobs Jenkins and, you know, Becca Brunstetter. And I mean, just like all of these people around that, you know, that time, that who I am still just like so excited to go see their work. But then there's also like this new generation. I know it's funny. It's like I'm 39 now, so all of a sudden there's this generation below me, and I'm like, whoa, I'm not the kid anymore. But there's this new generation of playwrights that's coming up that is so bold and so just like ready to make theater that doesn't apologize for itself and doesn't, you know, that just like cuts to the bone, and it's really exciting. I mean, it's really, really exciting. I mean, the kind of theater that I'm engaged in is, you know, kind of quieter and maybe a little smaller, but there's all these like new playwrights now that are coming out with these just like super ballsy plays that are, you know, it's just like so exciting to see like this new generation, you know, really actively remaking the theater, you know. So yeah, I can't wait to start seeing plays again. I mean, I can't wait.
Well, I will say the stories you tell may be intimate, but the themes are pretty enormous. So I think you're doing plenty of boundary pushing yourself. But I agree with you as an artistic director programming seasons. You know, I'm so grateful that ours is a company that focuses on new work, because there's just such a continual flow of incredible new work over this last, decade or so. As a company that started during that last economic crisis,
exactly,
was burning down. So
I also think that there's a more symbiotic relationship now between playwriting and film and TV, and a lot of people are grumpy about like film and TV kind of vacuuming up our talent, and I get it, and especially now, like I really hope film and TV realizes that, like, okay, guys, like the theater has been your major artistic incubator. Like, we're in crisis now, so step up and support us, But I mean, I'm being completely honest. Like, I don't think I would have been able to write the amount of plays that I've written if I didn't have health insurance through the WGA. Like I 10 years ago when I was doing no film or TV, I was paying for catastrophic health insurance. I was teaching all the time. I could only write 1 day a week, and now there's actually like playwrights are getting paid a living wage through film and TV, and that allows them to have the space to actually work on plays,
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that's really positive, because it wasn't like that when I was in college. Like, the idea of, I mean, I suppose there were some playwrights who were segueing into film and TV, but it really wasn't a thing. It's not like it is now.
The streaming services, I think, are like the reason we get to have such exciting new work. I agree with you completely. I see, like, almost every new playwright that we pick up a play by, we can also point to the series that they've been writing for, and we know that they've got, like you said, the capacity to do it because they've got a little bit of security to underwrite some risk taking.
Exactly.
That's pretty great.
And it seems like both media are now really starting to inform each other. I mean, I watch an episode of Succession and it feels like a play, and I'm sure that it's informed by so many people who are on that staff who have written for the theater over and over again for however long. Along these same lines, though, I know, so you've been adapting a film version of The Whale. You've worked as a producer and writer on Baskets on FX. Can you talk a little bit about some of what you've learned writing for the other media that then can inform what you do in the stage work that you're writing?
Yeah, I'm still figuring that part out. It's fun with the film adaptation of The Whale. It's a very specific thing. Like, one of my plays being turned into a movie that is actually like very similar. I mean, structurally identical to the play. So that's like kind of a very rare experience. You know what I mean? And so, but with other stuff, it's like, yeah, it's just more complicated. I mean, it's like, like, film is not considered to be a writer's medium. TV maybe more so is, but I think I am learning that, like, with TV and film, it's like I just need to be a little less precious about what I think is going to be really good and what's going to work really well, because it's just such a bigger ship that's being navigated by many people, and so I think it's kind of been an experience that's been kind of humbling in a really good way, and also just is like, and I think it's also really good for me to be less precious about my writing, like, and it's not to say that I, like, now it's like, anybody can rewrite my plays, I'm not precious. It's not about that, but it's like, I have my playwriting that I'm like, okay, like I'm in charge of the words here. Like, nobody can really change these words, and I'm going to be really deliberate and specific about what I'm doing here. But then I have all this other stuff where it's like, like that TV show Baskets that I wrote on, which was a blast to write on. But, and I think, like, there's elements of my voice that are in that, but, like, I was with a bunch of other writers, and, like, I wrote, like, I think 9 episodes of that show, but that means that there were 30 other episodes that I didn't write. And so like, it was this hugely collaborative process that I learned a great deal from. And I also love, you know, some of the stuff with film and TV that you can't do with the theater, which is sort of like, you can do things that are tiny and that mean a lot. You know what I mean? Like an emotional event can be, you know, a partially like that, you know, like that kind of movement in film and TV can really tell a lot in the way that it can't tell in the theater. So even though like theater is always going to be my first love, I think like it has taught me a lot about storytelling, you know, working in film and TV.
Yeah. We have a couple of teed up questions that Scott is sending us from the chat. The first one is just some folks are wondering if you have had a chance to watch the forward production.
I did.
Of Lewis.
Yeah, I thought they were lovely. Yeah, I thought they were so wonderful. And actually did kind of the thing that I was talking about earlier. You had those big kind of the Lewiston grade in the background, and you know, the kind of the big frescoes, and that was so cool to see. Like, oh, that was like my original idea of like how these might, or that was along the lines of my original idea of you know what I thought they could be, which was so wonderful.
I'm so glad you like that. I remember our scenic designer, Chris Dunham, we were talking with him and saying how important it was that there be a container for these two plays together. You know, because of course, initially we intended to produce them both on stage and have, you know, a long intermission in between to change over the sets. But obviously the container needed to be the same. And I remember when he sent me that photograph of the mountains, he said, I think this wants to be the painted drop. And I just said, it's the perfect combination of boring and majestic that I feel like
exactly
what we're going for in this, like both the myth and the reality of the West. Yeah, we're very fond of those.
Yeah, it was lovely. I thought it was really lovely and very true. I mean, very like, I'm sure your designer realized that like Lewiston and Clarkston are on that grade that all go down to the river. And so those, you know, mountains, those hills are just ubiquitous throughout town. It's almost like impossible to not see them. So I thought it was great.
Were there differences, just following up on Jean's question below, were there ways that you noticed it really feeling different seeing them? I mean, they were still stage plays, but related via film versus seeing them live in the theater.
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know if it's funny because I was telling you before we started this that like there's a recording of Lewiston and Clarkston at the Rattlestick production that I've seen. And I've always thought like, oh, this is like the best record. I mean, it was a really good recording. The guy shooting it did a beautiful job. But I think there's like also like an intimacy to the plays that kind of lend itself to film in a way that some of my other plays probably would not. Like I couldn't imagine a filmed version of like Greater Clements. You know, like I think that would be really weird. It would be I think it would be really hard to watch. So no, I was actually like I was pleasantly surprised again that I was like, oh, I think these plays actually lend themselves to this format, you know. And they were shot really well. Your guys' production was shot really well, I thought too. So
and Michael Proft asked if you would talk a little bit about your longtime collaborator Davis McCallum, and did it inform these plays or your other plays?
Yeah, Davis and I have worked on so many plays together. It's either like 8 or 9 at this point. So it's not all of them, but it's probably at least half of them. And I mean, it's so wonderful. I mean, it's like Davis and then my husband John, who is a dramaturg and who I met doing theater in grad school, are like, you know, my closest collaborators. And what happens after such a long form collaboration is there's just this this shorthand that develops that like, I'm sure it's really obnoxious for other actors because like, you know, we'll be talking about a scene and we'll be like, you know, like we'll be doing a play and I'll be like, you know, it's kind of like that moment in Bride New Boise where, you know, blah, 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 blah happens. Where it's, you know, it's kind of like that scene in Pocatello where they're trying to do, you know what I mean? And so we have this kind of like this long form developed vocabulary for how the plays operate that it's just like really, really helpful. But you know, and you know, the exciting thing about the collaboration too is like we continue to disagree on things, you know what I mean? And we continue to like, not in like an aggressive way, but like we continue to be like, like, I really don't think it's that, like there'll be a transition or something, or a moment of directing that I'll push against, and then there'll be a moment of writing that he'll push against. And those are always like really exciting, because it feels like that's where the real synthesis of the sort of playwright director relationship takes place. But yeah, no, I mean, it's great. And the other cool thing is, like, Davis is a real expert in Shakespeare. He runs Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, and Shakespeare is always his first love. And I love Shakespeare, but that was never really like the reason that I got into theater. And so Davis brings this sort of like wealth of knowledge of really the history of playwriting that I just don't have. And it's always so fascinating to me when he'll like talk about one of my plays and he'll like reference Richard III, and I'm like, that hadn't even occurred. You know what I mean? And it really just sort of sheds new light on the plays for me, and continually.
In addition to current collaborators, who do you list among your influences, writing or otherwise?
It's funny. I always struggle with that question, because it's like, I mean, there are playwrights that I adored growing up, but it's also like, it's hard for me to point to them and be like, and now you can see how my own plays are influenced. Like when I was in college, I remember discovering Edward Albee and really falling in love with him, but like, like his plays are very different than mine. They're more, I love his writing, so this isn't a criticism, but they're more cynical. They're just harder, they're harder edge. He's harder on his characters, and I really approached characters from the other side. And then like, like I loved experimental theater when I was in college. Like I interned at Richard Foreman's Ontological Hysteric Theater, and those plays bear no resemblance to anything that I've written. It's weird, like the art that sometimes is much more influential is in plays. Like sometimes it's like, like the photographs of Gregory Crewdson, or like certain modern composition that I really love, or I've always found it to be like much more helpful to think about art in terms that are not the theater, for whatever reason. That like if I like when I hear composers talking about their process, that always resonates with me like so much more than when I hear other writers talking about their process, or when I hear painters talking about their process, or sculptors, or whatever. Like there's something about like when you take away the vocabulary of theater and put it somewhere else, I can so much more clearly understand it. Whereas like talking about theater, I just feel like I always talk about theater, what I mean? Like that's what I do. So like when I hear somebody talk about like why they chose to write something in G minor and not E minor, like that's just always so invigorating,
Yeah.
That's awesome. In reading so many of your plays, I've always been, and I've been reading them and loving them for at least the last decade. And I'm always so moved by the way your focus on this really particular region of the country seems to infuse your work with this sense of place that ironically makes it seem even more universal, because we can all, I guess, relate to how we identify with our own place. But I'm curious if that sense of place has been evolving, because, listening to you talk, I'm realizing you've probably spent as much or more of your life in the New York area now as
which is crazy. I can't believe that. Yeah.
You spent growing up in Idaho. And as someone, I grew up here in Wisconsin and spent 16 years in the New York area before now being back here. And I'm just curious if your time now in New York is shifting that sense of place for you.
Maybe in ways that I don't really I mean, I'm sure it has, you know what I mean? And I think like at a certain point I realized that like, I'm not like, when I sit down to write a play, I'm not like, okay, I got to get it right. I got to get Idaho right. You know what I mean? It's really just more like, I'm interested in writing about a part of the country that isn't normally occupying our stages and screens. And, I still go back to Idaho at least once or twice a year. So I still have a very deep relationship, to the place. But it's just become kind of this, like the way I think about it is like, there's the Idaho where my parents and my brother live and the rest of my family. And then there's the Idaho that, exists in these plays, and they correspond to one another, but they're not directly reflective of one another. So I think like setting them in Idaho much more so than like being like, okay, I want to be the regional chronicler of Idaho, and it's more just sort of like, this is how the plays connect, you know, and this is how the plays sort of like plug into one another in a really fundamental way, and create what I hope is like a body of work and not just sort of like a disparate collection of a bunch of plays, you know.
We have a couple more from the chat. Someone asks, how often do you scrap story or play ideas? How do you know when you found an idea that you have to realize?
That's a really good question, because I have scrapped plays before, plays that I've, you know, fully written and developed and then been like, you know what, it's not there. I think for me, that moment is always when like I feel like I have to finish the play, because and I'm also the kind of writer that like I don't really allow myself to start writing a play until I know what the end of the play is. And I'm not saying that's the best way to do it. That's just like the fault in my brain that I just like, I have to know where I'm going to be able to start. So I do always sort of task myself with finishing it, which is hard. And you know, when I was a freshman in college, I didn't finish much because I didn't have faith in them, and I'd lose faith in them 30 pages later. But once I started to really make myself finish them, then I think I could sort of in a clear-eyed way be like, okay, is this doing the thing I wanted it to do, or did it really go off the rails? And sometimes, you know, like sometimes I think like, okay, this play went off the rails, never mind. But then it just keeps nagging you. And you're like, you know what, it did go off the rails, but like, I still think I know what it wants to be. So let's just keep hammering away at it, you know? But, you know, but then sometimes like a play will just feel like it comes out so easy that it was like on the tip of your tongue. But then you realize that, you know, when you get to the last page and you finish it, you're like, oh, this was too easy. This was like too, like it came out too, you know what I mean? It's sort of like there's nothing surprising here. And I'm not even talking about in terms of plot. I'm just talking about in terms of like there's nothing risky. There's nothing weird about it. There's nothing like that makes you kind of lean forward. It's just sort of like, I get it. ABC, you know, rising action denouement, like, you know, and yeah. So it was a very convoluted answer to that question, but
it's great.
I love this next question because I think it's going to tee us up maybe for some good, you know, horror stories. But do producers and directors ever surprise you with their interpretation of your plays?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. But that's kind of the joy of it, right? I mean, it's like, I mean, look, I'll be honest. Early on, you know, I don't see it. And this isn't because I avoid them. It's just because I don't have occasion to see a lot of plays of mine that have been produced, you know, late, just because like I'm working, you know what I mean? So I don't have, you know, and also like theaters don't have the money to fly you in or whatever, or maybe they don't want you there, you know? But yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember like early on in my career, I saw a production of a play of mine. They flew me in to see it, and they did something with the last scene that I was just like, I just had this like panic moment of like you just changed the whole play with one move, you know what I mean? Of like this character doing this one thing, all of a sudden the entire backstory of the play shifted. And then you're in a talkback and people are like asking you about it, you know, and you're trying to like delicately navigate around that. And so I think like early on, that was something that was really awkward for me, but now I'm actually really thrilled by it. And I actually love it when people do things that I like wouldn't expect or were really surprising. Because I realized that like that's what's awesome about theater, right? Is that these plays are these living documents, and they change, they become different things, they mean some things to some people, and then you know you realize them differently, and they mean something completely different. So, and that's so different from like film and TV, when you just like you make it and then it's done, you know, and. So yeah, even though it can be hard at times, like I think it's really awesome, and it's one of the reasons I love theater.
Great. We have another question from the audience right now. Do you ever see yourself incorporating your love of music into your plays formally?
Yeah. Hi, Karen, by the way. I have. And weirdly enough, the play that I was just talking about, A Case of the Existence of God, the one that was supposed to be in production right now, really the core of it was like I was listening to a ton of sacred choral music, and there was just something about it that and so there's a very small thematic element in the play of one of the characters studied I forget how he describes it, like pre-Baroque music or something like that, and he's really obsessed with this like really early antiphon or something that was newly discovered, and then I have another play called Rest that actually I was listening to a lot of Arvo Pärt, the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, and his music is actually an element in that play. And then I think in Bright New Boise, the kid is listening to like Villa Lobos and stuff, and so it's always kind of like finding its way in somehow. Oh, in The Harvest, he's listening to Quartet from the End of Time. It's actually all over the place now that I think about it. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm looking around here. So I wanted to come back to Lewiston Clarkston. I was one of my favorite moments in both of these plays is when we hear Catherine's recorded journals as she's walking the trail, and we sort of learn through the rest of the play that the sense of aliveness that character has in those recordings isn't really typical in the rest of her life. I'm actually really embarrassed to admit that it wasn't until after we closed that I sort of started to track that there's two instances of a documented journey in the play, in Clarkston and in Lewiston. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts about the separation from nature for both of those characters, Jake and Catherine, that is inherent to the drama of these plays. Are these people venturing into the wilderness in a way to feel complete, maybe in a way that they never have before? And if so, is that coming from your own experience? Do you prioritize a return to nature in your own life?
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that, but I do. Oh, it's funny. I'd actually never thought about that, but I definitely do have this really really distinct pull between rural and urban in my own life. Like I love living in New York City, but like I also crave nature in a really fundamental way. I think that's probably why we live in a neighborhood in Manhattan called Inwood that is mostly parks. And for us, it's like the perfect, just sort of like town and country kind of mix of like, there's a park that's big enough to get lost in and is actually Manhattan's only remaining native forest. But also the A train is right there, But I think in terms of the plays, I mean, I was thinking a lot about how, we have these idealized notions of what the Lewis and Clark journey was, but the other side of that is, Meriwether Lewis was an alcoholic who ended up killing himself, and he was in a ton of debt, and there's this sort of like, these guys had these idealized notions about like the Louisiana Purchase and their journey west. And then there was like the reality of who they actually were that sort of like came into stark relief for them. And so I wanted the same thing for these characters, that Catherine makes this kind of like quixotic decision to do the Lewis and Clark trail. And the joy that it brings her is so ephemeral, and when she actually reaches the ocean, it's this like really complicated thing that happens of like, oh, I did it, and it didn't do the thing I thought it would do. But then kind of the reverse happens in Clarkston, because I think the difference between the journey to the ocean in Lewiston is that in Clarkston they do it together. And I think that's kind of the fundamental difference between the two, is like those guys are only able to get to the ocean because they kind of locked arms and went together, So, and I think if Jake had done, because Jake's doing what Catherine's doing, in what Catherine did. And I think if Jake had gotten all the way to the ocean alone, it probably would have ended more similar to what happened to Catherine,
Right.
Yeah. We're almost out of time, which makes me wonder if there was anything that you wanted to say that we haven't already picked your brain about in this last 55 minutes.
No, I said this before, but I'm so thankful that Forward has done these beautiful productions. I mean, when I was watching these productions, I got so impossibly moved because it was just the first time in so long that I've seen a play of mine in a new production, not a Zoom reading, not a, like not a monologue on YouTube, like an actual, we're in a theater doing this together. And it just filled me with this like profound sense of optimism of like, because I was saying the other day, it's sort of like that for me, and I think probably for a lot of theater people, even though we intellectually know that the theater is going to return, when it all disappeared overnight, it felt really scary. I mean, it really felt like, wait, like, is it coming back? When is it coming back? And so to see it come back in the sort of beautiful way that you guys have brought it back is really meaningful to me personally. So thank you.
Well,
thank
you. TV may not be a writer's medium, but theater certainly is. And
that's right.
It starts with and ends with the plays. So we're equally, if not more so, grateful that you gave us, the gifts of these stories. And as we said before this started, they felt perfectly timed for all of us working on them emotionally for this final return to being back in our home, even if it does, as Jake said earlier, feels a little different in this pandemic world. But I do want to remind everyone who is listening to this that the show runs for one more week through April 25th. So there's 1 week left to see both of these beautiful plays. And tell your friends. You can get tickets and go to forwardtheater.com to learn more. But really, I just want to end with gratitude. Gratitude to Sam for the plays and for being so generous with your time to talk to us.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Gratitude to everyone who's tuning in to listen. And, the audience is the reason we're here. So thank you. Thank you for allowing us to keep bringing you stories, especially this year.
Yes.
And thanks, Jake.
Thank you.
And thanks, Scott Hayden, for producing this. Very much appreciated. Well, stay safe, be well. Safe journeys home to your family, Sam. And
thank you.
We can't wait to see The Whale and all of the other plays as they return to the stage in the coming months.
Yep, that's right.
Exactly. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Thank you. Good night.